They say you don't know your family until they are forced to choose between you and power. I never imagined mine would make that choice so easily, so quietly. I was born into a home of cracked smiles and carefully chosen words, where love was often a performance and silence had more weight than truth. We lived in a palace that stood tall on a hill just outside the old city of Igbodo, a kingdom known for its fierce warriors and ancient gods, where kings ruled by both blade and bloodline. My father was a chief, not quite royal, but close enough to taste it, and that taste, it lingered on his tongue like an addiction. My earliest memories are filled with marble floors, too cold for bare feet, ancestral masks that stared at you even when your back was turned, and long corridors that swallowed whispers. My mother Ayinki was beautiful, poised and deadly in her ambition. She wore her silence like a necklace of knives, only speaking when her words could cut. My siblings, Femi, the eldest, and Ifeoma, the youngest, were born into roles that suited them. Femi was the crownless king in waiting, always favored, always plotting. Ifeoma, the sweet-faced dove with eyes too sharp for her age, learned early how to manipulate tears like a currency. And then there was me, the middle child, the in-between. I was the listener, the one who sat behind doors that were meant to stay closed, the one who watched arguments unfold like theater but rarely took part. I believed my place was to keep the peace, to be loyal, to be invisible when necessary and present when required. I thought that was enough. It wasn't. My parents' marriage was a truce more than a union. Power had brought them together, not love. I used to watch the way they measured each other with their eyes, like opponents in an unending game of drafts. My father, Chief Oludare, was clever but increasingly desperate. His influence in the Council of Elders was slipping. His rivals were younger, richer, and hungrier. My mother, ever perceptive, had begun to whisper about aligning with the royal line. I didn't understand the weight of that suggestion until much later. There was an air about our home that shifted when visitors arrived. My father's voice became louder, my mother's laughter more forced. They entertained princes and warriors, traders and priests. The house transformed into a stage, and we, the children, became props, trophies for the guests to admire. See my son, so disciplined. My daughter, she has the grace of her grandmother. But behind those praise-slicked masks were plans, quiet negotiations, and promises made in rooms lit only by oil lamps and guarded by servants sworn to silence. The king of Igbodo at the time was Oba Adeyemi, a ruler both respected and feared. He had ruled for over 3 decades, and though his face had aged, his eyes remained sharp with cunning. They said he once poisoned his own cousin for plotting treason. They said he never forgave, only waited. And he was watching our family. I felt it in the way my father straightened his back whenever the king's name was mentioned. I saw it in my mother's eyes when she returned from court. Her lips pressed tightly like they were guarding secrets. Then came the first invitation. Oba Adeyemi requested our presence at the palace for the annual Festival of Ancestors. It was the first time our whole family was summoned, not just my father. I remember how everyone seemed on edge as we prepared. New clothes were tailored. Our ancestral beads were polished until they gleamed. My mother insisted we rehearse our bows and curtsies. "We are not just guests," she said, fixing my collar with trembling fingers. "We are being observed." That evening, the royal palace glowed like a mythical fire. Golden lanterns swung from carved archways, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, jasmine, and something older, something sacred. The Oba sat on his throne carved from a single Iroko tree, his face unreadable beneath his ceremonial crown. He barely looked at us as we approached, yet I felt his eyes scraping across my skin. Femi stood tall beside father, and Ifeoma curtsied so gracefully I thought she might float. And I tried to smile, but I saw it, that flicker in the Oba's eyes as they landed on me. Not admiration, not affection, calculation. The feast passed in a blur of music and murmurs. I sat beside Iphioma, listening to conversations between nobles that sounded more like riddles than speech. I caught pieces of my father's discussion with a general, then snippets of my mother laughing too hard at a merchant's joke. I knew something was unfolding, but not what. Not yet. Later that night, I woke to footsteps echoing through the palace halls. I crept from my bed and followed them, barefoot, down to the atrium. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, I swear I didn't. But once I heard my name, I froze behind a stone pillar. He is loyal, obedient, the perfect one, the king was saying. The others are ambitious, easily corrupted. But this one, he will not see it coming. My father's voice followed, softer, hesitant. We have raised him well. He won't resist if he believes it is for the family's good. My mother replied, her tone smooth like palm oil. He trusts us, completely. That is his weakness. They were talking about me. They were offering me. What exactly? I didn't understand, but I knew the sound of betrayal when I heard it. I felt it bloom in my chest like a wound. I ran. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the courtyard pond, staring at the reflection of the moon dancing on the water. I thought of all the moments I'd been loyal, all the times I defended them, loved them, forgiven them. And now they were preparing to trade me to the king? For what? Land, power, titles. I didn't know. I only knew that everything I thought was solid had begun to crumble, and that was just the beginning. The morning after the festival of ancestors arrived too soon. The sky had barely begun to bleed with dawn when the palace staff came knocking, polished, polite, and persistent. The Oba wishes to speak with the chief's second son, they said. Not your son, not our guest, just me, like a token already removed from the shelf. My mother appeared in the doorway of my room moments later. Her face was still, but I noticed the tightness around her eyes. She didn't ask if I had slept. She didn't ask if I was ready. She only said, "Don't keep the Oba waiting." That's a mistake no one recovers from. I wanted to ask her why. Why me? Why now? But I feared the answer, and something in her posture warned me not to provoke. So I nodded and followed the guards through hallways that no longer felt welcoming, corridors that had once shimmered with mystery and now pulsed with menace. They led me to the royal garden, a strange, silent place within the palace walls. It was sacred, I had been told. No blood had ever been spilled there. The air carried the soft hum of bees and the fragrance of agbalumo and mango trees in bloom. The king was waiting, seated beneath a carved pavilion draped in red silk. He wore no crown today, only a white agbada that pooled around him like cloud and shadow. His staff of office rested on the stone bench beside him. The moment I entered, he waved the guards away. His gaze pinned me like a blade. "You've grown taller since I last saw you," he said, his voice deep but curiously kind. "Your father spoke of your loyalty, your mother of your silence, and I have seen both." I bowed low. "Kabiesi, I am your servant." "Are you?" he asked, almost amused. "Or are you theirs?" I lifted my head. "I am my family's son." The Oba nodded slowly. "Yes, and they have sent you to me. Do you know why?" I hesitated. "To serve?" A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Partially, but not just serve. To secure." He gestured for me to sit across from him. I obeyed. My heart beat like thunder in my chest. He studied me for a long time, his gaze heavy, unblinking. Then he spoke. "There is a prophecy," he said, "that the next ruler of Igbodo will not come from the direct royal line. He will be one raised in shadow, loyal to none, and possessing a heart untouched by ambition. Your parents believe it is you." I swallowed hard. "A prophecy, Kabiesi?" "Do not mistake prophecy for promise," he replied. "But your family does not care for the truth. They believe if they give you to me, Train you, shape you, I will make you my heir. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt. But I am not royal. Yet you are acceptable, the king said, unblemished by politics. You see, the kingdom is restless. My sons are many, but none are strong enough to command the future. Your parents, they want to insert their bloodline into the crown, through you. I felt sick. So they gave me away? The Oba laughed quietly, not unkindly. Gave you? Number they sold you, for promises of land, gold, and favor in my court. You are their offering, their silent gift to me, a boy they thought would never resist. A wind stirred the trees. I looked at the Oba's face and saw not just a ruler, but a man weighed down by years of betrayal. Yet behind his calm exterior was a calculating flame. He wasn't just accepting an offer. He was setting a trap. What if I refuse? I asked, voice shaking. Then I lose nothing, he replied simply. And you? You will be cast out. Your family will say you dishonored them. The council will turn its back. The people will not hear your side. You'll vanish like smoke. He leaned forward then, voice lowering. But if you accept, you gain everything, not just power, knowledge, control. You'll learn the secrets of the throne. You'll sit beside me as prince, not by blood, but by destiny. I stared at him, stunned. And what do you gain? He smiled again, colder this time. A weapon your family cannot control. Silence stretched between us, thick with tension. I thought of Femi's smirk, of Ifeoma's manipulations, of my mother's calculating silence, and my father's desperate pride. Was I truly just a pawn? Or was I something more dangerous now? A piece removed from the board and taught to play his own game? I will consider it, I said. The Oba nodded. You have 3 days. Until then, you are my guest. He stood, and the guards returned to escort me back. But I was no longer the same boy who had entered the garden. That night, I didn't return to my family's quarters. I requested a chamber alone. I needed silence. I needed to think. Because now the question was no longer whether they had betrayed me. It was whether I would become what they feared most, their undoing. I spent the next 3 days drifting through the palace like a ghost in borrowed skin. The servants were polite but distant. My family avoided me completely. Even if Feoma, who used to sneak into my room to whisper secrets in the dark, wouldn't meet my eyes. Femi acted as if I no longer existed. And my parents? Their silence was louder than thunder. I understood it now. They had already handed me over. I was no longer theirs. I belonged to the throne. I thought of leaving, disappearing, running far into the northern deserts or hiding in the creeks of the delta, where no one would know my name or ask about kingdoms and bloodlines. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard the king's voice. A weapon your family cannot control. He had offered me something they could never take back, power. But it wasn't the kind of power you wear on your head like a crown. It was older, sharper, more dangerous. It was the kind of power that waits in the shadows and strikes when the time is right. The kind that doesn't scream or shine. It whispers and survives. And maybe, just maybe, I was done being the quiet son. On the 3rd morning, I returned to the royal garden. The Oba was waiting again, seated as before, but this time there was no ceremony, no silk, no guards, just 2 stools beneath the Iroko trees. You've made your decision, he said, not a question. Yes, I replied. He nodded slowly. Then from this moment forward, you are no longer their son. You are mine. The words hit like a drum beat in the chest. No longer their son. Just like that. My inheritance, my name, my place in the family. It dissolved in the wind. I was something new now, something undefined. The king stood and placed his staff in my hands. It was heavier than it looked. I felt its weight not just in my arms, but in my spirit. You will not be a prince of ceremony, he said. You will be a prince of knowledge, of silence. I will teach you what no one else is allowed to learn. The history buried under the palaces, the old magic the priests pretend not to believe, the truth about kingship, and the lies that keep it alive. And he did. Over the next year, I was trained in secret. While Femi flaunted his status in the court, and my father preened over meaningless land grants, I was taken to chambers beneath the palace. Rooms filled with scrolls, maps of the old kingdoms, and tablets etched in languages long dead. The Oba introduced me to scribes who had no names, advisors who had outlived 3 kings, and warriors who carried scars from battles no one remembered. They called me Omo Iran, the Shadow Prince. My first lesson was silence, not the silence of fear, but the silence of watching. I learned to read people like books, the twitch of a smile, the pause in a sentence, the lie hiding behind a compliment. I was taught the laws not as they were written, but as they were used. How favors could buy loyalty, how secrets could bend men stronger than steel, and how betrayal was not an accident, but a currency. In time, I was introduced to the Ikuise, the Council of Shadows, an inner circle that existed outside the official court. They had no titles, wore no uniforms, but they moved the kingdom like puppeteers. I was their youngest member. They didn't trust me at first, but when I revealed what I had overheard that night, my parents' exact words, their tone, their plan, they began to see me not as a pawn, but as a blade. Meanwhile, word began to spread of unrest in the outer provinces. The Oba's sons were fighting among themselves. 2 had taken opposing sides in a trade war that turned violent. Another was found dead in his chamber, poisoned. The official story was illness. The truth, no one dared say. But I saw the Oba's face when he received the news. He didn't mourn. He studied the maps of the kingdom for hours, fingers tracing the borders. This kingdom is no longer about lineage, he told me. It is about survival. One day he summoned me to a private chamber lit only by firelight. A clay bowl sat between us, filled with palm oil and ash. He took my hand, drew a symbol on my palm and said, "From this day, your loyalty is to the people, not to blood. Your mission is to protect Igbodo from itself." And I understood what he meant. My family was not just guilty of betrayal. They were a threat to the future. They had aligned themselves with others who wanted to fracture the kingdom, to divide it into smaller fiefdoms ruled by petty ambitions. They thought their deals with the Oba had secured them power. But what they didn't realize was that the Oba had already given that power to me. I was no longer afraid. I no longer cared for their approval. I was going to bring them down, not with rage or revenge, but with patience, with precision, like a true son of the shadows. Because I had learned the greatest lesson of all. The one who is cast away can become the one who controls everything. And I was ready. When you become the thing your enemies fear most, they stop seeing you as human. And that's exactly what I wanted. The whispers began subtly, just like we planned. The markets of Igbodo are never truly quiet, not even in the early hours. Gossip rides faster than horses in this kingdom, and soon names began to fly through the alleyways like smoke. Chief Oludare's trade deals were under scrutiny. His lands, once protected by royal favor, were now mysteriously being taxed beyond reason. His name disappeared from the ceremonial invitations, and the seat he once occupied during council sessions, left vacant for urgent travel. The truth was simpler. He was being erased. Femi, proud and drunk on his self-importance, tried to intervene. He visited the palace 3 times in 1 week, demanding answers. I watched from the corridor shadows as he raised his voice to men who pretended not to know him. He thought he could demand presence. But in Igbodo, power is not in presence. It is in perception, and Femi no longer had either. The Oba never acknowledged his visits, but he sent me to watch. In my new role, I was assigned to oversee disputes in the western provinces, a post once held by my uncle. Officially, I was acting under the king's orders to restore peace after a land feud. In truth, it was my first mission against my blood. You see, one of the clan's chief Oludare had betrayed years ago had finally come forward, presenting old land agreements he had destroyed, deals that had displaced entire villages to build palm oil estates. I met with the elders under the cover of night. They spoke of exile, of hunger, of broken shrines and desecrated groves. When they asked for justice, I offered them something more permanent. I had them brought to court not as beggars, but as plaintiffs. On the day the hearing was announced, I returned to the palace to witness it myself. My father walked into the chamber with his head held high, expecting to crush the matter with influence and ancient name. But as he entered, I stood already seated, at the Oba's left side, dressed not in royal garb, but in the deep ochre robes of the shadow office, a color no one wears unless they speak for the throne. The silence in the room was unlike anything I'd known. My father froze. He looked at me, confusion wrestling with pride and panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but the king raised his hand before a word escaped. Then the Oba gestured to me. "Speak," he commanded. I rose slowly, and for the first time, I addressed the court not as a son, not as a victim, but as a judge of legacy. "This matter," I began, "is not just about land. It is about betrayal. Betrayal of trust, of responsibility, of the very people this house was sworn to protect." I read the agreements aloud. I presented the testimonies. I cited decrees that no one expected me to know, ancient and buried, but valid under royal law. I watched as my father's jaw clenched, his lips pressed so tightly they turned white. I saw my mother seated behind him, her eyes no longer sharp, just hollow. Femi tried to object, but his voice carried no authority anymore. Ifeoma didn't come. When the Oba stood to pronounce judgment, the entire court leaned forward. "Chief Oludar of the House of Oludar," the king said, "you are hereby stripped of your titles, lands, and privileges. Your name shall be removed from the records of the royal court. You are to be exiled from Igbodo before the setting of the third sun." My mother gasped. My father looked at me with eyes I had never seen before. Not angry, not pleading, broken, and I did not look away. As they were escorted out of the chamber, I stood still as stone. My hands didn't tremble. My face remained unreadable. But inside the storm raged, not of guilt, not even of vengeance, but of clarity. I had become what they feared I would never become. Stronger than their schemes, wiser than their secrets. I had not only survived the betrayal, I had redefined it. That night I wandered the palace gardens alone, the same place where, months ago, I had sat across from the king and heard the prophecy that would reshape my life. Only now I wasn't wondering why me. I was asking what next, because something had changed in me, something final. This wasn't the end of my story, it was the end of theirs, and the beginning of something much more dangerous. Power once tasted does not release you. It does not sleep. It does not forgive. After my family's fall, I thought I would feel lighter, as if the weight of their betrayal would vanish once they were gone. But it only shifted, moved deeper, heavier, because power always demands more. And soon it began to whisper in my ear at night. I became known throughout Igbodo, not by name, but by presence. I walked through the royal courts and men stepped aside. The markets grew quiet when I passed. Those who once praised Femi now offered me their blessings in hushed voices, their children staring at me with a mixture of fear and reverence. Some called me the Oba's true heir, others called me cursed, a shadow prince with no roots. But I knew better. I was being shaped for something greater. And that kind of shaping always attracts one thing: prophecy. It was the Oba who sent me to the mountain shrine, a simple message delivered by a silent messenger. The oracle requests your presence. Do not delay. It was not a suggestion. It was law. You did not ignore the oracle, not in Igbodo, not when the spirits were stirring. I traveled for 2 days alone, up through the twisting paths carved into the sacred hills of Agbani. The air grew colder the higher I went. Trees whispered ancient songs in the wind, and the rocks beneath my feet felt like they remembered every footstep that had ever touched them. By the time I reached the temple, a crooked, vine-covered ruin older than the kingdom itself, I could feel eyes on me. Not human eyes, something older. The oracle was waiting inside. She was blind, but when she looked at me, I felt completely seen. Her face was carved with the stories of 100 years. Her hair was woven with bones and dried herbs. Her voice, when she spoke, felt like thunder disguised as a whisper. "You come carrying the blood of betrayal," she said, "in the shadow of a future no one understands." I bowed, heart pounding. "I come as the king's servant." She chuckled bitterly. "No, child, you come as the king's weapon. But even a weapon must ask, whose hand wields me?" She beckoned me closer and laid her fingers against my forehead. The moment her skin touched mine, I was no longer in the temple. I was elsewhere. I saw fire sweeping through the kingdom, the palace in ruins. A man in my face, but older, harder, wearing a crown carved from bone and flame. I saw Femi kneeling, head bowed, blood trailing from his lips. I saw the Oba, aged and sick, reaching out to me with regret in his eyes. And above all, I saw myself standing at the gates of the spirit world and the ancestors turning away. I gasped and pulled back. "What was that?" I demanded. She sat still. One of many futures, not yet written, but dangerously close. I shook my head. "That is not the path I've chosen." "No!" Her eyes, sightless, pierced me. "Then beware, Shadow Prince. For every betrayal leaves a scar, and not all scars stay buried. You think the Oba gives freely? He is a serpent of vision. He molds you not to serve the people, but to protect himself." I faltered. "He saved me, gave me purpose." "He gave you a mirror and told you it was a window," she said. "He made you his son to erase his own failings. But beware, when the time comes, he will sacrifice you as quickly as your family did." My blood turned cold. Then what must I do? The oracle reached into a clay pot and pulled out a small carved figure, an effigy. It looked exactly like me. She placed it in my hand. "You must find your name again," she said. "Not the one they gave you, not the one they stole, your true name. And when the kingdom begins to bleed, remember this. A prince raised in shadow must either become the light or devour everything." I left the mountain shaken, not because I believed her completely, but because part of me already knew she was right. The Oba had given me power, yes, but he had never given me freedom, and I could feel it now. Chains, invisible but tightening. The crown was nearer than ever. But so was something darker, a cost I hadn't yet been told, and I had a choice to make. Would I become the light she spoke of, or the darkness they all feared? When I returned from the mountains, I was not the same. I carried the oracle's warning like a stone in my chest, silent, heavy, inescapable. I began to see things differently. The palace halls no longer felt sacred. The king's throne, once a symbol of wisdom and might, now looked like a cage dressed in gold. And the Oba himself? I watched him more closely. The way he handled courtiers like chess pieces, the way he smiled when others were in pain, the way his eyes glimmered not with mercy, but with possession. He had crafted me, yes, forged me from rejection and betrayal. But now I realized I was not a prince. I was his blade. And when a blade grows too sharp, even its master starts to bleed. The first spark of rebellion came from a place I didn't expect. My mother. She returned to the capital under the guise of penance. Word spread that she had renounced her ambitions, sought refuge in a distant shrine, and come back cleansed. I knew better. Ayinki Oludar never bowed unless she was planning to strike from below. One afternoon, I received a message from her, unsigned, unsealed, but unmistakably her words. We need to talk. You were never the enemy. Foolishly, I went. We met in the old market square, in the ruins of what used to be our family's trade hall. She wore plain clothes, no jewelry, no paint on her face. But even without her usual regalia, she commanded the air like a storm waiting to break. You're stronger than I expected, she said without greeting. I crossed my arms. You expected me to be dead, she smiled thinly. Number broken. That's different. What do you want? Her eyes scanned my face, and for the first time, I saw something that wasn't calculation. It was fear. You think the Oba will give you the kingdom? She asked. You think he sees you as anything more than a transition? I didn't answer. He's dying, she continued. Slowly. The cough, the fever, you've seen it. He's hiding it well, but not for long. And he's made enemies. Enemies you helped create, I spat. She nodded. Yes, and I know them, which is why I came. I narrowed my eyes. Why now? She looked away, then back at me. Because the kingdom will soon tear itself apart. His sons are gathering armies in the east. The generals are divided, and the people are hungry. You are the only thread left keeping it all from unraveling. And what do you suggest? That I make you queen mother? She actually laughed. No, my son. I suggest we survive. That night I couldn't sleep. The oracle's words, my mother's warning, the rumors I had been hearing of uprisings, of loyal guards deserting, of royal granaries being looted by supposed insiders. I returned to the Oba's private chamber unannounced. He was seated by the fire, coughing quietly into a silk cloth. When he saw me, he hid it. You bring news yet? He asked. I bring a question, I replied. Do you trust me? He chuckled, a hoarse, tired sound. Trust? My dear son, I made you. Trust is irrelevant. You are what I say you are. And there it was. The final confirmation. I was not heir. I was not son. I was tool. And tools, when worn, are replaced. As I left the chamber, something inside me hardened. If the kingdom was going to survive, it would not be through blind loyalty or whispered obedience. It would be through fire. And I, once pawn, once sacrifice, would become the fire they all feared. It began with the quiet ones, the servants who had no voices, the guards stationed in forgotten towers, the old scribes who had been recording the fall of kings long before I was born. They were the first to come to me, not with offerings, not with praise, but with warnings, whispers of chaos in the outer villages. Ships arriving at night from the southern coast, no flags, no markings. Men vanishing, rice stores emptying. Couriers found dead in rivers with sealed letters never delivered, and at the center of it all, a name. Mine. Someone was stirring rebellion using my name like a drumbeat. The forsaken prince has returned, they were saying. He is not the king's son, he is the people's. It wasn't my doing, not at first. But I didn't stop it either, because deep down part of me needed to believe it, that I could be more than what the Oba made me, that my birth, my pain, my survival meant something, that I wasn't just shaped for destruction, but destined for redemption. So I let the rumors grow. I fed them quietly, sending emissaries to outer clans who had been ignored, meeting secretly with chiefs who had lost sons in the Oba's proxy wars. I didn't promise them the throne. I promised them dignity, order, peace. It was the one thing no one else was offering, and so they came. One by one, villages pledged allegiance, not to the palace, but to me. The Oba noticed, of course. He wasn't blind, but his sickness had grown worse. His breath was shallow now, his hands trembling when he reached for his staff. He began holding court only once a week, sometimes skipping entirely. Whispers of his death had already begun to circle, though no one dared speak it aloud. Femi reappeared, not as a brother, but as a threat. He had aligned himself with two of the Oba's sons. He returned to the capital, leading mercenaries dressed in the colors of a forgotten province, claiming they were a private guard. He even requested audience with the Oba, declaring himself the rightful successor. But he wasn't interested in the crown. He was hunting me. It was only a matter of time before the first blade was drawn. It happened one night during a gathering in the Hall of Elders, a formal dinner meant to honor one of the fallen generals from the southern coast. I knew it was a trap the moment I saw the seating chart. Femi directly across from me, two strangers to my right, an empty seat to my left. I sat anyway. The food was bitter, the music too slow, and then the lights went out. Screams, steel against steel. I rolled beneath the table just as a dagger struck where my heart had been. I fought in the dark, shadows moving around me like wolves. But I was ready. I had trained for this. I didn't fight to kill. I fought to survive. When the lights returned, 3 were dead. One was my own former guard, and Femi, gone. That night, I received a single letter, delivered by a boy with no name. The seal was familiar. My father's crest, faded but intact. The letter read, "He wants you dead. They all do. Come home. We must end this together." It could have been a trap, but I went anyway, because sometimes in order to rise, you must return to the place where everything fell apart. I traveled in silence, disguised. No royal procession, no flags. Just a man with a blade and a name too heavy for his chest. When I reached the ruins of our ancestral home, it was nearly dusk. The same broken courtyard, the same statues crumbling under time's cruel hand. And there he was, my father, older, smaller, but still with that same fire in his eyes. "You've done well," he said, not as a compliment, but as an accusation. I said nothing. He stepped forward. "The king will not survive the season. You know that. The throne is exposed. Femi has become mad with envy. Ifeoma whispers poison into every ear she can find. Your mother plays both sides like a flute. And you? You stand at the edge, still unsure whether you're a man or a myth." "I didn't come for speeches," I said. He nodded. "Good, because I didn't summon you to speak. I summoned you to choose." "Choose? Between them and the kingdom?" His voice was hoarse now. "You're not the boy I sacrificed. You're the man who survived the sacrifice, which means you owe no one anything, not even me." We stood in silence, the wind moving gently through the fallen leaves. And then he said the one thing I didn't expect. "You must take the crown." I blinked. "You want me to be king?" "No," he said. "I need you to, because if you don't, Femi will. Or worse, one of the Oba's bastard sons. And the kingdom will bleed. I am not of royal blood." "You are of royal spirit," he said. "That's rarer." I didn't give him an answer. Not that night. But something inside me shifted. Because for the first time, I stopped running from the throne and began walking toward it. The palace felt colder the day I returned. Not the kind of cold that comes from weather, but the cold of watching eyes and hidden blades. The Oba hadn't spoken publicly in 3 weeks. Rumors said he was confined to the inner chambers, his body failing while his sons warred like vultures over his still-breathing corpse. Femi had returned with a larger guard. Ifeoma now sat beside ministers in meetings where women were never welcome, her rise as silent and venomous as a snake in moonlight. And the nobles, they had become wind. Whichever direction they felt the power shifting, they leaned. The kingdom was fracturing, and everyone knew it. I walked into the great hall at midday, alone, as drums echoed through the high ceilings. Courtiers hushed. Ministers watched with clenched jaws. The Oba's sons lined the throne dais like lions before a kill. Even my mother stood there, dressed in white, her eyes unblinking. But the throne itself sat empty. The room held its breath. And then, the doors opened behind me. The king entered, no crown, No staff, no royal guards, just an old man in white, carried by two silent priests. His hands shook, his breath wheezed, but his eyes, those terrible, eternal eyes, still burned with something more dangerous than power. Clarity. He motioned weakly for the priest to lower him before the throne. Not on it, beside it. And then, with a voice that rasped like old firewood, he spoke. The kingdom must choose its future. No one moved. Then he looked at me, not with affection, not with pride, with warning. I stepped forward. I did not bow. I did not smile. I looked not at the throne, but at the room, at the generals, the traitors, the elders, the sons of the Oba, and the whispering shadows at the edge of the court. Then I spoke. I did not come to beg for power, I said. I came because the people no longer recognize your faces. Gasps. I continued. This throne has become a mirror for those who want only to see themselves. I did not ask to be chosen, but I was betrayed, shaped, and tested in fire by the very hands that now fight for power, and still I returned, not to rule, to rebuild. Femi stepped forward, laughter on his lips. And who are you to speak of rebuilding? You are not blood, not son, not prince. I met his gaze. Number, I am the result of all your sins. I am what is left when everything else burns. Silence fell. Then the Oba raised his hand. Come, he whispered. Take it. I approached the throne, slowly, carefully. My feet felt like stone. My chest ached. Every memory screamed at me to turn back. But I kept walking, and when I reached the throne, I did not sit. I turned. I will not wear this crown unless the people call me, I said. Let the elders speak. Let the villages speak. Let the priests and the farmers and the traders speak. A murmur spread. You want to be king? I asked them all. Then let it mean something again. The next week, the kingdom held its breath. Messengers were dispatched across provinces. Public councils were called in village squares. Not a vote, not a coronation, a reckoning. And when the responses returned, scrawled in ink, carved in bark, whispered from hilltops, they all bore one name, mine, the Forsaken Prince, the one who had survived the blade. But with the crown came the curse. 2 nights before the ceremony, I woke to the sound of drums in the distance. Not royal drums, funeral drums. The Oba was dead. No one claimed to know how, but I knew. He had waited for me to rise before he let go, and in doing so, he left a kingdom in my hands and a curse in my heart. Because now, every betrayal I had survived, every shadow I had walked through, every sacrifice I had endured, it was mine to carry, and I had no more excuses, only power, and a kingdom that would either rise with me or fall by me. The coronation was not a celebration, it was a storm. Thunder cracked through the skies that morning as if the heavens themselves were torn between blessing and warning. The rain fell without mercy, drenching the courtyard of kings where the people had gathered, not because they loved me, but because they had chosen me. And in choosing me, they had dared to break tradition, to abandon the royal bloodlines, to defy the children of the Oba, and place the future in the hands of a prince forged not by birthright, but by betrayal. I stood at the altar of kings, cloaked in dark blue, the color of twilight, neither day nor night, a color for someone who belonged nowhere, yet now stood at the center of everything. The high priest of the ancestral flame placed the crown in my hands. Not on my head. He whispered the ancient words, "Power is not given, it is claimed, and with every crown comes blood." And then he stepped back. It was up to me. I looked around, at my mother silent in the front row, at Femi, glowering from the edge of the crowd, his fist clenched, at the council elders, some nodding with pride, others watching with suspicion, and behind them, the people, so many faces, eyes filled with fear, hope, desperation. And it struck me. This crown would not save them. It might not even save me, but perhaps, just perhaps, I could stop the bleeding. I raised the crown above my head, and then I knelt, not in surrender, in remembrance, for the boy they tried to sacrifice, for the son they cast aside, for the prince they never planned for the man they now feared, and then I rose and placed the crown on my head. Thunder roared, the kingdom for a moment was silent. Then came the chants, not of joy, of warning. Oba Ninu Okunkun, the king in the shadows. It was not a name of praise. It was a name of power, of fear, of consequence. I ruled differently. I stripped the corrupt of their titles, redistributed lands stolen through decades of manipulation. I outlawed backroom marriages between noble families used to control the provinces. I created a tribunal for the unheard, where farmers, fishermen, and weavers could stand and speak before ministers who were once untouchable. They called me reckless. They called me dangerous. They called me divine. I did not care, because the only approval I craved was from the ancestors. And they remained silent until the blood came. It started slowly. A village poisoned near the border. 24 dead. No clear culprit. Then a warehouse fire in the capital, destroying rice meant for famine relief. Next, an ambush on a convoy carrying young royal advisors. 3 were beheaded. 1 survived, left alive to deliver a message carved into his chest. This is not your kingdom. I knew the signs. This was not rebellion. It was civil war. I summoned the council. Only half came. The others were either dead, in hiding, or worse, openly siding with Femi and the remaining royal princes, now exiled in the east but gathering strength. Rumors said they had joined with foreign allies, mercenaries from beyond the sea, that the crown I wore had ignited the dying embers of the Oba's bloodline into full flame. They would return, and when they did, they would bring fire. And so I prepared, not as a boy, not as a victim, as a king. But even kings bleed, even kings fall. And as I stood one night atop the palace roof, staring into the horizon where smoke already rose in the east, I heard a whisper I had not heard since the mountain shrine. The oracle's voice. You must find your true name. And in that moment, I understood. The kingdom had crowned me, but I had not yet claimed myself. And until I did, the war would never end. The night I went searching for my true name, I left the palace in silence. No guards, no robes, no blade, just me and the memory of a child who once believed love was enough to protect him. I traveled north to the place of my birth, not the house of titles and ceremonies, but the village from which my grandmother fled when my father married into the chiefdom, a place they tried to bury in shame, the place my mother forbade us from speaking of, the land they told everyone no longer existed, but it did, barely. The village of Aramu was now little more than scattered huts and ruined walls. Time had eaten its roads, rain had swallowed its fields, but the people had stayed. What was left of them? They remembered me, not as a prince, not as a king, as the boy who cried when his grandmother was buried under the baobab tree, as the quiet child who chased fireflies in the yam fields and fell asleep during folktales. They welcomed me not with songs but with silence, reverent, respectful, honest. And then she came, a woman no one had mentioned for years, bent with age but eyes burning brighter than coal. Her name was Mammy Ope, my mother's aunt, the only one who had dared curse my father at his wedding for abandoning their blood. She looked at me and did not bow. "You've come for what was stolen," she said. I nodded. She led me deep into the forest, through thickets that bled sap like tears until we reached an ancient shrine, a mound of stones blackened with ash, surrounded by carvings older than any writing I had seen. "This is where your real name was first spoken," she said, "but your mother buried it, and your father let her." She poured water into a calabash and whispered something into the wind. Then she pressed my hand to the surface of the water, and I saw, not visions, memories, my naming ceremony, a circle of drummers, my grandmother weeping with joy, a name whispered over and over, Ayotade, not the name I had been called, not the name on royal scrolls, but mine, Ayotade. Joy has returned, a name of hope, a name of healing, a name that held no ambition, only light. I pulled my hand back, trembling. Why did they hide this from me? I asked. Because they knew it would free you, Mami Ope said. A man who knows his true name cannot be controlled. Tears slipped down my face, not of sorrow, but of release. All my life I had fought to prove I was worthy, of their love, their trust, their legacy. I had let their betrayal become my identity. I had worn it like a crown of thorns. But now I understood. They had betrayed a version of me that never truly existed, and the man I was, Ayotade, had survived all of it. That night I returned to the capital, not as a prince, not even as a king, but as myself. And the first decree I gave upon return was to erase the name they gave me from every scroll, every stone, every law. From that moment forward, I ruled not as the shadow they feared, but as the joy they tried to destroy, Ayotade. And as the fires of civil war approached the gates, I stood taller. Not because I was unafraid, but because for the first time in my life, I was whole. The war came with drums, not the royal kind, not the ones that celebrate birth or coronation. These drums were older, wilder. They sounded like bones on hollow wood. An ancient rhythm meant not to call celebration, but spirits. They beat through the hills before the enemy arrived. Femi marched at the head of the rebel host, dressed in crimson robes stained darker by rain and rage. Beside him rode two of the Oba's sons, long exiled, now crowned with desperation and ambition. Their army was vast, foreign mercenaries with scarred skin and eyes that spoke no language we knew, disgraced nobles who had nothing left to lose, and deserters from our own royal guard. They carried banners dipped in black oil, each one marked with a single word, restoration. But what they wanted was revenge. They thought I would cower, that I would beg the remaining provinces to send men, that I would barricade myself behind palace walls and pray for intervention from the gods. They didn't know me anymore. They had never truly known Ayotade. I didn't send for reinforcements. I sent for the people, the farmers, the hunters, the women who ran spice markets with daggers tucked beneath their wrappers, the elders who had buried kings and lived to curse them. I called them not as subjects, but as defenders, and they came, not because they loved me, because I had listened to them when no one else did. In the nights before the final siege, we filled the courtyards of the capital with song, not war chants, songs of birth, of water, of planting seasons, the kind of songs that remind people what they're fighting for, not just what they're fighting against. And in the center of it all, I stood, not in armor, but in woven cloth dyed with the colors of the soil. I had no crown on my head, only purpose in my voice. On the day the gates were breached, they thought we would break. We didn't, because by the time their army entered the capital, we were already among them. The fishermen had sabotaged their river supply. The children had mapped their footpaths. The marketplace women had smuggled weapons into the rebel camps, disguised as gifts. We fought not as soldiers, we fought as people who refused to be erased. Street by street, alley by alley, we pushed them back. Femi made it all the way to the throne room, but when he arrived I was waiting, not with a sword, with his name. Femi Oludare, I said, using the full weight of our father's house. You are not my enemy. You are my mirror. He raised his blade, but I didn't flinch. You tried to kill a name I no longer answer to, I said, and for that I do not hate you. I pity you. He charged, The room watched. I moved aside, and he fell not by my hand, but by his own momentum. His sword struck the obsidian floor, shattered, and he landed hard, his wrist snapping beneath him. When he looked up, I saw the truth. He had never wanted the kingdom. He just wanted not to be forgotten. I knelt beside him, whispered words no one else could hear. "I remember you." And with that, he wept. The war ended not in fire, but in silence. And in that silence, a kingdom found breath again. The days that followed the war were not filled with cheers. They were filled with burying. The dead were not counted by sides. They were counted by names, by mothers left hollow, by fathers who held silence tighter than shovels. The markets reopened, but the songs were quieter. Children no longer played near the palace, and in the corners of the city, even the statues of old king seemed to bow their heads. I walked among the ashes, not as a ruler above my people, but as one of them. Everywhere I turned, I was reminded, a crown does not protect you from grief. One morning, I stood over the graves of the unnamed fighters, the ones who had defended the kingdom with nothing more than sticks, kitchen knives, and unshakable faith. Some were no older than 15. Others had gray in their hair and stories carved into their scars. None would be remembered in the history books written by court scribes. But I remembered them because they didn't fight for me. They fought for us. As I placed my hand on one of the graves, a small girl approached. Her eyes were swollen, her hands shaking as she held out a piece of cloth. I opened it. Inside was a bracelet, beaded, crude, beautiful. "My brother made it before he went," she said. "He said it was for the real king." I took it in both hands. I didn't say anything, because words don't comfort grief. Presence does. I tied it to my wrist, and I never took it off again. That night, in the privacy of my chambers, I finally let go. I wept, not the tears of weakness, the tears of a man who has carried too much for too long. Tears for the child who had been betrayed. Tears for the boy who had been sold. Tears for the prince who had been used. Tears for the king who had won, but lost pieces of himself in the process. My advisor, an old scribe named Durajaye, entered quietly. He had been with the palace for over 50 years. He had seen 3 Obas crowned, 2 murdered, and 1, myself, made from the bones of the broken. He said nothing as he poured palm wine into a clay cup and placed it beside me. Then he said something I will never forget. "Even kings must empty their hearts, or they will drown from within." I looked at him. "Do they remember the kings who cry?" He gave a sad smile. "Only the ones who cry and still rise." And so I rose. The next day I declared a 7-day fast, not of food, but of politics. No decrees, no titles, no judgments. Instead, I walked the streets, sat in courtyards, listened to tailors, to teachers, to blacksmiths, to pregnant mothers and grieving fathers. Because a king who does not hear the heartbeat of his people becomes deaf to the truth. On the 7th night, I stood before the temple of ancestors and offered a final prayer. Not for power, not for peace, not even for forgiveness, but for wisdom. Because I had finally learned the greatest truth of all. It is easy to become a king. It is much harder to remain human while wearing the crown. And when I closed my eyes at night, I didn't dream of thrones or armies. I dreamed of my true name, Ayotade. Joy has returned, even if it came wrapped in shadows, even if it came bleeding. It came. Rebuilding a kingdom is not like building a house. You do not simply lay new stone over old blood. You do not sweep away the bones and pretend the past never happened. To rebuild a throne from ashes, you must first touch the fire that made those ashes. You must let it burn your pride, your plans, your illusions. Only then can you begin again. And so, I began again. Not with edicts or fanfare, with questions. I called the surviving elders, not just from the noble clans, but from the far-off corners of the kingdom. I invited warriors, traders, storytellers, and slaves-turned-landowners. I even summoned the priests who once refused to recognize my rule. And I asked, "What do you need? What has been taken from you? What kind of kingdom do your children deserve to inherit?" At first they were suspicious, rightfully so. They had been used as pawns for too long, but slowly they began to speak. They told stories of dry seasons made worse by corruption, of border taxes that broke families, of ancient traditions forgotten in the name of expansion. They spoke of kings who had reigned with clenched fists and sons who had inherited only fear. And I listened. Every word. I abolished the royal levy that bled farmers during harvest. I returned sacred lands to priesthoods that had been displaced by war. I created a circle of councils where commoners held seats alongside nobles. The nobles resisted. Of course they did. But I reminded them, politely, firmly, what had happened to those who underestimated me. This time, they did not laugh. And slowly the city changed. Walls were repainted, not with royal murals, but with the colors of the people. Tribal patterns from the east, forest glyphs from the south, desert claws from the north. The markets were expanded, roads were repaired. Song returned, not as performance, but as prayer. Children began to play near the palace again, and one day a woman approached me as I walked the streets with no guards. She looked poor, tired, but her eyes held warmth. She placed her hands on my shoulders, something no one had dared do since my coronation, and she said, "Oba Ayotade, we don't fear you anymore." That night I returned to the royal court and ordered that the golden throne be removed. Instead I commissioned a new seat, carved from the Iroko trees of Arimu, lined not with ivory but with the woven fabrics of every province. At its center, the symbol of the kingdom, a circle cracked through the middle, not broken, healed, because I wanted every person who entered that chamber to see what we had survived and what we had built from it. I was no longer the shadow prince. I was the king who wore scars like armor, who bore a name once buried, who had loved his people more than his position. And on the day I sat on that new throne, there were no drums, no trumpets, just silence, a sacred silence. And in that silence, I finally heard the thing I had waited my whole life to hear. Peace, not perfect, not permanent, but real. It happened on a day when the sun rose without color, a quiet dawn, too quiet, no footsteps in the courtyard, no whispers in the council chamber, no rustling of palm leaves, and most disturbingly, no drums. In Igbodo, drums are breath. They speak when voices fail. They call the people to markets, to prayer, to weddings, to war. There are drums for mourning, drums for warning, drums for waking and sleeping. But on this day, the city was still. At first I thought it a coincidence. Perhaps the royal drummers had fallen ill. Perhaps the markets were observing a fast. But then came the messenger. His tunic was torn, his forehead smeared with black clay. He didn't bow. He didn't ask for permission to speak. He simply dropped to his knees and said, "They've taken the drum of spirit." The words hit like thunder. The drum of spirit, Ilu Emi, was the oldest drum in the kingdom, said to have been carved by the first Oba himself, guided by a vision from the gods. It had never left the palace grounds, not during war, not during famine, not even during the coup of the Red Year, and now it was gone, stolen. We searched every chamber, every corridor, questioned every guard. We even called the royal priest to cast divination. All we saw in the bones was shadow, nothing. I summoned my war council. They expected fire from me, threats, fury. Instead, I said, no search parties, no arrests, let the silence speak. They looked confused. Some even whispered that I had gone mad. But I knew what I was doing. You see, drums are not stolen for gold. They are stolen to send a message. And this message was not about rebellion, it was about memory. That night, I sat in the royal courtyard alone. No guards, no servants, just me in the moonlight. And then, a sound. So faint I thought it was a dream. One beat, then another, rhythmic, familiar, software. But not from the palace, from the outskirts, the slums. I followed the sound in secret, weaving through back alleys, past sleeping goats and snoring watchmen. The beats led me to an abandoned shrine. Crumbled walls, moss-covered idols, ash scattered in the wind. And there, seated in the center, was an old man I'd never seen before. He was blind, but his hands knew that drum like a mother knows the heartbeat of her child. The Eluimi rested on his lap. He didn't look up as I entered. He simply kept playing. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough bark and riverstone. "You remembered your name," he said, "so we return the drum to the people." I stepped forward. "You stole it from the palace." He shook his head. "Number we took it back. You rule from a new throne, Oba Ayotate, but the spirit of the kingdom still sits outside your walls." He stood, slow, deliberate, and handed me the drum. "It is not a symbol of power," he said. "It is a reminder that the kingdom does not belong to the ruler. It belongs to the heartbeat beneath his feet." I carried the drum back myself through the sleeping city, and when the sun rose, I ordered a gathering in the central square. No ministers, no nobles, just people. I struck the drum 3 times, once for the past, once for the pain, once for the promise, and the people answered, not with cheers, but with hands on hearts, eyes raised to the sky, mouths whispering prayers that hadn't been spoken in years. The drums had fallen silent, but we had not. And from that day forward, no decree in Igbodo was made without the drum of spirit speaking first. Because I had finally understood, a king may hold the scepter, but the drum holds the soul. They still tell the story of the boy who was born in a house of shadows, of the son who was given away like a coin, of the brother who watched his blood try to erase him, of the prince who was trained to obey, then rose to reign. They tell it in the northern hills where the yam fields whisper to the wind. They tell it in the western markets where palm wine spills like laughter after hard days. They even tell it in the court schools where young scribes dip their quills and dare to ask, how does betrayal become a throne? And the answer always is not found in the crown. It's found in the name, Ayotade, the name they buried, the name I reclaimed, the name that meant joy had returned, even if it returned scarred, bruised, limping through the ruins of what once was. Years passed, and I aged, not like the kings before me, who clung to youth with fear, drowning in herbs and elixirs and lies. I let time shape me. I let the lines form across my face, each one a story. I let my beard turn gray without shame, because it reminded me of the day I stood before a throne that was not yet mine, wondering if I would survive long enough to sit on it. I watched new generations rise, children who had never known the war, boys and girls who thought of me not as a shadow prince or a cursed king, but simply as Ayotade, the one who listened, the one who walked among them with no guards, the one who wore a beaded bracelet on his wrist that no royal cloth ever covered. The girl who gave me that bracelet grew up, became a teacher. Her students now greet the drum each morning before they greet the flag. And still, I carry the weight, not of regret, of memory, because the truth is, I was never meant to survive. I was supposed to disappear the moment my family chose gold over my name. I was supposed to be the sacrifice that oiled their ambitions. But I became something else. I became their mirror, their judgment, their lesson. And one day when I felt the end nearing, not from illness, but from intuition, I walked alone to the mountain where the oracle once marked my path. The shrine was older now, weaker, cracked with vines and silence. But she was there, older, smaller, still fire in her bones. "You came," she said, her voice like dry wind over stone. "I had to," I replied. "You told me to find my true name. I found it. But I still have one question." She nodded. "Why did they choose me?" I asked. "Why was I the one they sacrificed?" She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Because only those who are broken in secret can rebuild in truth." I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a lifetime, I felt peace like a familiar hand on my shoulder. When I returned to the palace, I gathered the scribes, and I told them, "Write it all. Do not spare my shame. Do not erase their cruelty. Let every child who reads these pages know the truth, that betrayal is not the end of a story. It is only the beginning of a greater one." And that is how the tale came to be. Not just of kings and kingdoms, but of a boy once betrayed by his own family, who rose not to avenge them, but to build what they never could. A throne made not of gold, but of truth. A name not inherited, but earned. A kingdom not ruled by fear, but remembered by joy. Iota Day. The king who wept, the prince who survived, the child they tried to forget, and the name they could never erase. The end.